and dexterous and skilled multimedia artist, Chattrapati Dutta's practice explores the issues of colonial and post-colonial India in a local and global context. The escalating consumerist and hybrid practices of a developing nation, its transforming social and political relationships within a class and caste hegemony are important concerns of the artist, that he often looks through the lens of city of Kolkata. Influenced by myriad sources, Chhatrapati Dutta employs the subtle nuances of material to articulate complex symbols and metaphors. His works are characterized by an eclectic handling of media. As a believer in, quote, making as a progress, unquote, his drawings, paintings, and installation based objects are imbued with a pluralism of ideas rendered in a gyrating mass of collage. Professor Dutta negotiates the personal experience interaction with the world of print culture with his ideas and concerns over the global. The artist reassesses the position of the individual self as set against the macrocosm of culture. Professor Dutta has exhibited widely in the country and abroad. He is the founder member of Khoj Kolkata. He has initiated, conducted, and participated in several national and international seminars, symposiums, and workshops. He has been a regular Sunday columnist for Hindustan Times for over 5 years. Having taught at the Faculty of Visual Arts, Rabindra Bharati University from 1995 to 2007, he is presently the principal Government College of Art and Craft, Calcutta, since 2017. Today, the topic of his lecture is Tradition and Modernity, the Artistic Journey of Abanindranath Tagore. Thank you. Over to Professor Dutta. Just before the lecture, I want to say two things. One, please, everyone, keep your microphone mute during the time of lecture. And please don't raise your hands. When the chat box will open, just put your question in writing. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chatterjee, and good evening, all of you, learned friends. I'm sorry for the technical glitch that has taken over half of an hour of this program, but I think with all the advantages of technology, we also have these disadvantages, and most of the time does infringe on our requirements. However, I will start my presentation with slides. So I will start presenting now, and share entire screen. Is it visible?
Yeah.
Not yet, sir.
Is the screen visible, ma'am?
এবার চালু হয়েছে।
Can you see the screen? Hello?
হ্যাঁ স্যার,
Hello?
দেখা যাচ্ছে। হ্যালো, হ্যাঁ স্যার,
হ্যাঁ,
স্ক্রিন
দেখা যাচ্ছে?
পরিষ্কার, একদম পরিষ্কার।
Okay, okay. So, tradition and modernity, the artistic journey of Abanindranath Tagore. Uh, uh, I think it is very important for us to understand that we are about more than 150 years away from the times of Abanindranath Tagore. And not only do we need to shift our focus away from present days, but also understand the situation and the time during which Abanindranath Tagore um, worked and uh, showed in Kolkata and elsewhere. Abanindranath Tagore being born, as you all know, in the Tagore family in 1871 and lived up to 1951, he was initially, of course, a public symbol of Swadeshi art, Swadeshi in art actually, not Swadeshi art, but uh, who is generally understood as somebody who's given the Indian people an identity and a ready-made sort of formula for an Indian style, which is not really true because Abanindranath himself has not ever uh, stood by any particular style or mode of representation by himself. It was, and thus he is largely misunderstood as a revivalist and as a person who is the uh, uh, beginner of the so-called Bengal school. It is also important to understand that during Abanindranath's time is also parallel to that of the time of the Swadeshi movement, which is brewing, of the uh, struggle for independence, which is brewing during the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And Abanindranath happens to be the first real artist of British India who was the first modern art artist, actually, so to say, and begins the modern art movement in India, which is a huge thing to say. And what we will try to understand is how he begins and what are possibly the sources of his beginning. We all know that he he is born into a family of highly talented uncles and a host of brothers and sisters who are each one uniquely talented in their own sphere. And we see here how Abanindranath on the left is playing the Esraj, and of course Rabindranath is singing to his tune. We see the same practice of Rabindranath continuing until his late days. And just for the reference, that his first and most revered pupil, Nandalal Bose, initially visited him at the Thakurbari and showed his first works. This is a very interesting work by Nandalal Bose, which actually tells us about the Tagore family itself and the environment in which Abanindranath and the others grew up. Just to illustrate the drawing, Nandalal himself is sitting on the floor and making drawings and sketches. He is being guided and hello. He is being guided and also possibly critiqued by A.K. Kumarasamy. We see uh, Shuendranath Tagore deeply immersed with his book at the background. We see Gogornath also sort of halfway into his siesta with his hookah. And Abanindranath himself in the background at the extreme end, who is having his good afternoon nap, having finished his gorgora. We also see images all around of paintings and idols, which illustrate the sort of cultural ambience within which all this is happening. We also see uh, and on the left is Abanindranath, who were extremely good friends throughout their lives. And Dokhinar Baranda, as we all know, the site of their workplace, was a brewing ground for so many ideas and so vast a space of developing literature and art. To begin with Abanindranath's very early works, we should understand that Abanindranath was initially uh, open to a majority and variety of art traditions of the East and the West, where he had gradually tried to uh, inculcate influences from Mughal and Rajput miniatures, from the Ajanta frescoes, from Chinese and Japanese paintings, from the European pre-Raphaelite and Art Nouveau trends. In which sense we also understand that Abanindranath is actually an extremely eclectic artist in that sense. And it is very important also to understand, before we begin with the growth of Abanindranath, that Abanindranath never associated art with what we call shikha or training, because for him, art was always a shock. So there's this huge difference between somebody who can not only associate uh, art with shock, which is, if we might say, fancy, where he, as an individual, goes through several trainings, but at the same time is extremely sort of uh, definite in what he and his understanding about art would be. So if we see his initial illustrations, because Abanindranath begins his, apart from very early childhood works where often his niece recollects later that Abanindranath found, when he really looked out into the open and really tried to see things, how it was different from what he had learned from the European books as to how huts looked. So here we see Abanindranath nearly, his first sort of illustrations of Shapnoprayan, and from where we see an attempt of Indianizing illustrations, which are extremely then in vogue through illuminated books that were coming in to the Tagore family, and also were highly available in Kolkata, rather than our own publications with illustrations, if we understand the time properly. And then we see how from the initial illustration of Shopnoprayan, he moves on to more basic observation of life around him, and moves away from the sort of, idealized Western illuminated illustration patterns, which he desperately tries to Indianize. But here in the second illustration, we see him move away far from there and much closer to the reality around him. And then further, we see how in Damayanti, he has mastered not only drawing, but also color as well as ambience and perspective. So we will initially see how Abanindranath begins by trying portraiture, and he is trying to really grasp the European methods of drawing and illusionistic sort of realism, which comes in from the Kensington school. And we also know that this is the time he is training under Gilhardy, especially with pastel portraits of friends and family. And we can see right at the beginning also that Abanindranath is an extremely dexterous sort of artist who very, very quickly adapts and becomes a master of line, even in the European sense of the term. Then we also see that he is not happy with Gilhardy anymore, and then he moves on to learning anatomy and portraits from C.L. Palmer, who is really from South Kensington, and the real influence that we have had of the British academic style that moved in through the art schools that the British had built parallelly in Chennai, Mumbai, Kolkata, Lahore, which is now, of course, in Pakistan. And they initially wanted to train the natives to become good draftsmen, to become people who could record botanical as well as human figures, as they did wherever and whichever place they colonized. But they also brought in from South Kensington School the art of portraiture, the art of landscape, and the art of painting in oils. And we see Abanindranath here by then already mastered the oil painting, and he is already creating narratives which are in a way extremely Indian, because this is, of course, as you all would recognize, the birth of Sita, and Sita is coming from under the earth through the plow, which the farmer finds. So, on the one hand, we see Abanindranath trying to replicate or illustrate and narrate an Indian subject, but with and in a completely European mode. And if we look at the figure or even the bull, uh, we understand that he has completely adapted the figuration. The figure itself looks like a Greek person, uh, and the the light, the chiaroscuro of the ambience, all of it sort of very European in representation. We also see him doing these masterly portraits. This is, of course, the portrait of Debendranath. But we see the mastery that Abanindranath has already there by then uh, uh, acquired in pastel as well as oil, as well as in pencil, and gradually even in watercolor. But uh, his tenure with Palmer actually ended once Palmer asked Abanindranath to study a skull. And that was possibly the last day that Abanindranath ever went to Gilhardi anymore. And in the meantime, we see how by then he is already influenced, as I said earlier, by Jyotindranath and Rabindranath, who influenced him immensely. And the trio of Abanindranath, Govindranath, and Shabarindranath played a very important role in his development. Uh, young Abanindranath actually moved in phases between different interests, uh, from the vocal to the instrumental, from music to acting, from stage decor in plays by the dramatic club that was founded, poetry and play reading in informal art club that was formed, which all of you must be uh, acquainted with, the Kamkhyali Shobha, which was formed in the 1890s. So this is the sort of cultural ambience in which Rabindranath is gradually growing up, and he is also uh, gradually beginning to write. And his initial writings between 1895 and 96 would be Shakuntala and Khirer Putul, through which we also understand the uh, the highly evocative pictorial understanding of Abanindranath, even in his writings, and the level of imagination where mostly, of course, Abanindranath is, which we find even in his later writings, are often autobiographical in a lot of ways. So And it's also important here to understand that the great role Rabindranath plays in his life, who also gifts him uh, a set of books which actually open up the world of the traditions of Indian art to Abanindranath. And from which Abanindranath completely is moved and shifts strictly away from the British academic um, and the Kensington school styles of realism. And through several practices, he arrives at the Krishna Lila series. So I think it is very evident as to the clear shift that he has made from his earlier works to something which Abanindranath is sort of gathering from all his lessons from Ajanta and the Mughal and the Rajput miniatures, as well as from, as I mentioned earlier, the pre-Raphaelite and the Art Nouveau trends. But essentially bringing in, through narrative, a completely Indianized version of imagery which possibly never existed before in the modern sense. And Abanindranath also sort of brings in text as an important part of his visual imagery. And we see how the whole Krishna Lila series is filled with, sorry, uh, script which he develops on the one hand from the Persian style and also Davangiri and Bengali put together. And this becomes actually the turning point in Abanindranath's career. Though by now he has already illustrated and sort of illuminated is a better word, the Shukla Vishar, where we see European illuminated manuscripts, influences from that, and the Geet Govindo by Joydev, which he does in 1898-99, and this a little later, the Krishna Lila series. And we gradually see how in the Krishna Lila series, he brings in humor, new spatiality in the content, where here we see how Krishna is dressed up as a woman and comes and meets Radha through the private passage, and brings in a different narrative, a different emotional and social connection, which was somewhere, and of course the sense of ambience and bhava, which we again find in Abanindranath's own writings, uh, the new adaptation of the Shorango, which he does a little later, of course. So the Krishna Lila series actually gives him a vast scope of integrating all the lessons of the miniatures, the watercolor that he has mastered by then, and also creating new formats, new visual formats, which never existed before. And this is where we understand how, on the one hand, Abanindranath remains steeped in tradition, but at the same time extends outwards through the branches into the language of modernity. Another small close-up of the same series. And then, of course, we will arrive at the masterpieces, which happens around the 1900s. But before this, it is also important to remember that it is in 1896 or 97 that Abanindranath meets Havel, E.B. Havel, who is by then the principal of the government college, or then the school. It wasn't a college yet. And how it is the great influence of Havel which changes Abanindranath to this extent. On the one hand, we have Rabindranath and Jyotindranath, especially Rabindranath, who was extremely fond of Abanindranath, and because of the great talent that he saw in Abanindranath. But also, it was Havel who helped Abanindranath in realizing a lot of things which Havel himself was trying to discover and understand. It is important to know that Havel was, prior to coming to Kolkata, Havel was the principal of the Madras Art College, as it was then called. And in the Madras Art College, he already, in his 10 years tenure there, had completely convinced himself that unlike what the average Britisher or the colonizer thought, Havel realized the great amount of uh, art treasure in not only painting but also in sculpture, architecture, and other forms of creativity, even in daily life, and especially in the traditions which Havel himself had studied and collected, traveled quite a lot, initially from Belur Halibid to Bhubaneswar and different parts of Orissa, and gathered the idea that he himself, being from the part of the British academic school, realized the great talent that and treasures that existed in this country. And it was he who introduced Abanindranath to these great traditions again. And during his tenure, it was, some of you must know that the principal of the art college was also the curator of the art section of the Indian Museum. And initially they were interconnected building, and the principal could move from the college to the Indian Museum directly, looking after the art collection. And by 1905, to which time we will come a little later, Havel brings Abanindranath to the Government College of Art and Craft. So We will come to that a little later, but by now, this the initial masterpieces are happening in the beginning of the 1900s. The building, there's a typo error here. This is the building of the Taj, where you will see how great, with such eloquence and dexterity, the Mughal miniature is adapted by Abanindranath. And he is not only calling back uh, tradition, but he is also directly nearly referring to the recent past. And somewhere, all this from a very Swadeshi sort of a standpoint. Because recalling history, we will see later on, becomes an important tool for Abanindranath to work with, along with narration. So, from the building of the Taj, he moves on, and we see how elegance and uh, finesse moves in, simplicity moves in. It is the where the subject is dominating the whole picture frame, and how minimal he is being able to bring down his works to. You will have to please excuse me for a second. Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, so this is the traveler and the lotus. So uh, the ploy that Abanindranath um, weaves into his works silently is through the sort of narration he's trying to make here, where we are not sure if the traveler is moving away from home or whether the traveler is coming back home. But what we definitely see is that he is uh, keenly looking at the lotus which he has picked up from the pond, and possibly he is seeing his dear one in the lotus, or either he is remembering his dear one while he is on his way, on his travel, or he is possibly taking back the lotus and to whom he is coming back after his long travel. So the metaphor of the lotus plays multiple roles uh, in Abanindranath's hands. Same with Obisharika, where Obisharika is within an elaborate framework of geometric and floral patterns, which Abanindranath adapts from Mughal and Persian miniatures, sets the sort of stage for a very dark space within which there is such a fragile, as if very fragile, Obisharika, who is possibly even shaken with the sound of a whisper. And this delicateness of the Abhisharika is brought in through the delicate handling of the textile, of the finesse in the transparency of the material, the posture in which he makes the figure stand alone in that darkness, bringing in the whole mystery of the darkness around. And then we come to the most important and most famous work of this period, which is, of course, the passing of Shah Jahan, which he I think, paints in 1902. Building of the Taj, which we saw earlier, was possibly 1901. And the passing of Shah Jahan was first exhibited in the Delhi Darbar exhibition, which Curzon held in 1903. And we see again how Abanindranath utilizes the architecture of the not purely Mughal, but of something which is a mixture of Persian, Mughal, as well as Hindu architecture, places Shah Jahan on the bed, looking far away at his most treasured memory, which is his wife, in whose name and in whose memory the Taj is built. And of course, we see Jahanara seated at his feet, looking and wondering at the loss of her father. We all know that Shah Jahan was sort of in captivity within his chambers by his son Aurangzeb, and we know how Jahanara fights back for Shah Jahan, but Shah Jahan by then is too frail and unable to get back his past glory. But the most fantastic achievement of Abanindranath here is the bhava he brings in. The even through the landscape, even through the rendering of the, nearly midnight sky and the peeping moon, but all this done in the mastery of his oil. So we see how Abanindranath uses oil painting, which of course he doesn't use much longer after this. But we get the extent to which we see Abanindranath mastering the oil paint, moving away from the strict and light chiaroscuro of the rendering that is generally taught throughout the European tradition, and comes to a language and an imagery which is completely unique and Indian in all aspects. He also was fortunate to have had the Japanese connection of Kakuzo Okakura from 1902, who goes back to Japan and sends Taikan and Hashida Shunso in 1902 and 3, who are residing at the Thakurbari, who are introducing the Japanese language, pictorial language, as well as the Japanese wash technique to the Thakurbari artists, out of whom Abanindranath is the greatest of the students. And we see here how soon Abanindranath can adapt a medium and absolutely absorb its essence and translate them into his own unique visual imagery. Meghdootam, as you would all have read through the cloud messenger, again, where Abanindranath brings in the greatly uh, e- enhanced ambient influence into his image. And we also see how he refers back to literary texts in different ways, but does not really illustrate them, but goes far beyond that, which was one of the criticisms most of Abanindranath's critics initially had. And we know how wrongly he was judged by most of the critics of his time. Of course, the iconic Bharat Mata, which he paints in 1905, which is also, as you all would know, the year of the partition of Bengal. And how it is here that Rabindranath comes down to the streets of Kolkata to tie Rakhi, brings in the ritual of Rakhi to this part of the world as a gesture of brotherhood between Hindus and Muslims. And Abanindranath here creates Bharat Mata, the one of the images that was possibly most circulated, most reproduced, and reached the largest corners of the country during that time. Much more than possibly even Ravi Varma's oleographs or prints would have reached. Because of its time and because of the imagery which he has created, where divinity and the human are nearly parallelly set together in an evocative mother image who brings in clothing, who brings in knowledge, who brings in food, who brings in aesthetics and the sense of the religious together in trying to bring out the woman who in several forms have been idols and has been revered and have appeared in so many avatars in the Indian iconography. So this is Abanindranath in 1905 when he joins the Government Art School as the vice principal. And since this time, Abanindranath is also not only by then established as a extremely talented and extremely influential artist, but he has also by then become a comrade of E.B. Habel in bringing in this change of Indian art into the greater art scene. Here we will see gradually the power of Abanindranath getting unleashed through extremely evocative images and somewhere also being able to relate to history in so many ways. The falling camel, a symbol which he again brings in through certain narratives, and maybe talks of the sunset evening where the high burden of colonialism is no longer even allowing the camel to keep its front leg straight and collapsing down. The mystery of Abanindranath in realizing images, it comes through in this very interesting horizontal image of a very secret meeting between Tagore, Gandhi, and Andrews, where Abanindranath's narration does not identify a locale. It is placed in a neutral, warm background, which has no local specification. We see Rabindranath in a very pensive mood. We see him deeply engrossed in thought about the present situation of the country, the present situation of the people, and he is communicating it through whom? And communicating that to Gandhi, who is, in that sense, far more relaxed. But we see Andrews in the background nearly, who is recording the two stalwarts of history and brings in this whole privateness to the discussion and also the great seriousness of the time without identifying even time or space in the painting. Is Abanindranath's extreme sense of understanding of composition, color, space, and ambience. Now, I would like to take you through another great adaptation of Abanindranath of landscapes. And it is very interesting to see how Abanindranath, even through his landscapes, actually sort of brings in a narrative element to us. So there is a series of sketchy watercolors, which of course is done with great mastery and skill, which he calls Jagannath Temple to Mashirbari. We know what the relation of the temple to the Mashirbari is. That's where he goes during the Rath Yatra. Jagannath's temple to Mashirbari again, which you see again is transformed without either the temple or even the Mashirbari. but wants to bring in a parallel to the great grandeur in the historic context of it and possibly the contemporary context of it. Stormy Beach at Puri is one of those very minimized uh, sort of imagery of a seaside where we feel the storm brewing very far away and possibly not yet sort of descended on this shore, but would very soon, in a way, sort of creating that ambience of that power in the work. Now here we will see constantly how, again, Abanindranath employs this travel being a very important sort of metaphor in Abanindranath's work, where he is taking again from Puri to Konarak, where there is no reference to either the Konarak temple or the Puri temple. From the next one is titled Shorgodar to Konarak, where of course again here we see the Konarak temple, but the Shorgodar is not the Shorgodar we actually know in Benares, in Puri, and Shorgodar to Konarak again, where each time there are two frames which seems to be connecting one another, but actually also can be viewed individually. But there seems to be a logical connection and a disconnection within the landscape he is creating. But finally, when he comes to this image of Shorgodar to Konarak, we don't find anything. So, which Shorgodar is he talking about here, where there is a silent breeze blowing away just a silent bit of sand from the beach into the dark waters of the sea? So he makes us wonder and question what would be the Shorgodar here and what would Konarak mean here in this work. So this is the sort of narrative, emotive narrative that Abanindranath silently leaves in his work, especially in landscapes. And here we will see a series of these Shahjatpur landscapes, which are comparable to some of the greatest masters of Western landscape painting, where there is extremely minimal use of color as well as tone, but immense amount of ambient emotion put into the image. This is also where actually in Shahjatpur or in the State Horse, we see how Abanindranath is constantly looking for alternative narratives. So we know the State Horse somewhere always refers to the Ashwamedha. But here this is a different Ashwamedha. And what is he? Who is he going to be captured by? And which territory would he mark? A lot of Bengal landscape is actually revealed to Abanindranath through the Shahjatpur landscapes. And I think he enjoys them thoroughly in turning them into such post-romantic, I would say, works. Often it is interesting to watch Abanindranath only in silence, such as this, where the lesser said, possibly, the more the image speaks to us. On the one hand, we see the train arriving. Shahjadpur is far in Bangladesh. And then on the right, we see a small sort of harbor, sort of a port, which largish sort of boat anchored there. So again here, there is that sense of travel, that sense of movement, which Abanindranath constantly brings in. And somewhere there is the circularity, and somewhere the train would move, it wouldn't move away from the picture frame, as if it would go around and go back to the harbor and then come back again. Such is the extent of Abanindranath's narrative skills, which of course we also find in most of his writings. Here we see the grave of Makhdoom Sahib, and we see Makhdoom Sahib's grave at the background. But the traveler who has come, again, that sense of traveling, the traveler has come far because he's traveling with a donkey, he's traveling on a horse, carrying the donkey, carrying all the things he would need on his travel. There is also the old man behind the donkey who is also possibly at the end of his journey, and who is coming to Makhdoom Sahib's grave is somebody who is also possibly at the end of his own journey. We see that far off boat nearly floating on the left, far behind, and possibly going to a destination it never knows. So through the grave, he is talking of the life beyond. And we see in front of the grave, we see a man digging deep into the well to fetch some water. So is this man in search of that last bit of water that he would find in his well of life? Where has he reached? These are interesting questions that Abanindranath proposes and brings for us through his narrative, which he, interestingly sort of hides the whole thing in the canopy of this very old, large tree, which is nearly covering the whole sky. With this, we will come to the last bit of my presentation, which is possibly the Arabian Nights, the greatest work of Abanindranath throughout his life, which he himself sort of wrote about, saying that I leave this with you. You will find all my life's experience in it. So, which Abanindranath understand, Abanindranath created this 40 odd images within 1 year. And he again, for his critics, which is in 1931, and for his critics for the last time also possibly gives them the chance to say that again Abanindranath has fallen back on a narrative, on a text which they think would be sort of illustrated by Abanindranath. But what Abanindranath actually does is that throughout his life, Abanindranath's progression are like dialectic shifts in the image-text relationship. And, you know, uh, as we see, his illumination of Shaptoprayan and Chitrangada, or the Omar Khayyam and the Falguni and Mohammudgar series, he's sort of graduating from illustration to visual equivalence and from visual equivalence to interpretive images. And this possibly he does best in his Arabian Nights series, where the image text and image text relationship actually achieves a conceptual complexity and complete intellectual sophistication in this series. And possibly this is very rare, not only in world art, but certainly in the context of Indian art, modern art itself. So here we also mane, the shift which he comes to in Arabian Nights is from self-expression, from evocative images to a more fact foregrounding narrative. Which is like, I should read out what he writes in Apun Katha, where he describes what he saw in his childhood from his window. And he says, men, hen, ducks, coach horses, grooms, coachmen, Chiru the scavenger, Nandu the housekeeper, Govindo the lame, the old sweeper, the bhisti, the porter, the Uriya bearer, the rent collector, the clerk, the gatekeeper, the mail runner. They put on a grand jatra in the northern courtyard, he is writing. From morning till the hour of sleep, I sat watching the many amusing events unfolding on that side. Some of the brick dust road, some on the big brick dust road, some at the round about it, some within or outside the houses of the milkmen, or on the roof of some house beyond. It was like watching an animated folk theater, not a grand tragedy or comedy, but a few moments or movements, a few gestures, a picture or two. It could be said I was watching a farce packed with these. So you see how even from his childhood, Rabindranath is actually seeing this drama happening around. It is like the Baudelarian traveler or the stroller, who is not a very keen observer, but viewing the world like a theater. Men and women passing by like characters, and events took place and took the form of stories. Uh, so Abhinav's engagement with the literary text from foregone eras did not make his work literary or turn them into illustrations. The formalist strain in art criticism that dominate modern art writing presided over likes of Roger Fry and Clement Greenberg, ruled the art form, was destined to survive for the realization of its innate possibilities and ought to guard it from being populated by other mediums, is what is written about his critiques. So, Actually, a majority of what he wrote was, as I said earlier, autobiographical. ঘরোয়া জোড়াসাঁকোর ধারে আপন কথা, ভূতপত্তির যাত্রা, ভূতপত্তির দেশ, দেশে মাসি, or as we already know, শকুন্তলা, ক্ষীরের পুতুল, নালক, রাজকাহিনী, আলোর ফুলকি, হ্যাঁ, খাজাঞ্চির খাতা, বুড়ো আংলা, খানাবাড়ির কারখানা, all of them somewhere or the other brings the narrative to the foreground. What can be said of his writings is also true of his paintings in general, and Arabian Nights in particular. So we see how in Arabian Nights he is actually not referring directly, and we will not find even one of the images really giving us the notions that we had of Arabian Nights. Of course, we know that he selects Arabian Nights because of the strong content of storytelling, which Abanindranath is very fond of. So here we see the Shehrazade being led into the bridal chamber. And as we know, the Arabian Nights is about how the Shehrazade finally decides to go to this villainous person who would unflower, or the wazir who would unflower a woman every night and would sort of kill her the next morning. So Shehrazade is that challenger which Abanindranath selects to encounter the wazir. Now here we see possibly Shehrazade is arguing with her father, who does not want her to go, but she says, with a book in her hand, that she has the power of narration. And we see how Abanindranath indicates the amount of, we know here that Shehrazade by then is already aware of the stories of kings and emperors throughout the land. We see that through the collection of books. We see her younger sister, who is also carrying a book. So possibly, and the father, who in whose hand there is a book. So maybe it's a family of storytellers. And Shehrazade takes up the challenge of going to the evil wazir. And what does she do? She keeps the wazir engaged through these different stories. And these different stories for Abanindranath also is sort of like a mixing ground of different styles. And it is like, it's like Picasso, who said, after all, the art are all the same. You can write a picture in words just as you can paint sensations in a poem. This is what exactly Abanindranath does. And he, though, was a painter and a writer rolled into one. And the two mediums were interwoven in his career, just like maybe sculpture and painting were in Michelangelo's. telling stories through pictures and painting images with words came naturally to him. And he would have readily agreed with somebody like Kitai, who said, some books have pictures and some pictures have books. And having freed themselves from either pursuit constraints, many more artists today find it possible to mix books and pictures or paintings, nourished by both literary and painterly sensibilities. So, I'm sorry, the Arabian Nights is one of the early landmarks of such paintings. So, this is how Abanindranath gets into his own city, what he experienced around him in Chitpur, all woven into the stories of the Arabian Nights. This is the hunchback of hunchback of the fishbone, uh, which Abhinath completely transforms here. He, at the bottom, you will see he brings in the possibly the Parsi or the Persian perfume maker and seller. On the bottom, we see the cans and bottles of perfume, even through this window. Then we see possibly a Marwari merchant who is trying to open the cage of a bird, and a cat is perched on the top of the roof waiting for possibly the bird to fly out. We also see how the narrative of the uh, hunchback is turned into a very serious sort of tragic incident when finally the tailor and his wife, they have to sit him up, and the fishbone has come out by then, but we see how they are struggling to sort of keep him alive. Another story woven in at the top, middle and top is the Tagore and Company banner, which was actually the real company of Devendranath, uh, who wanted to have this car company, but finally the British did not actually allow him to trade in cars. And on top, we see the artist himself, who is seated in possibly one of the Boitokhanas which Abanindranath would have grew up in. And now he is entertaining his British friends, though not really engaging in the evening, but entertaining them certainly. As we see silently that it is about 2 o'clock in the clock. So the night is quite progressed, but still young, because the bottle is brought in and the drink is again being filled. And what is interesting also is how memory plays a great role, where Abanindranath actually hides the image of Devendranath, which the painting of which we understand is covered with the hand-drawn pankha. We see the top of the hat of Devendranath, and it is this painting which Abanindranath had experienced throughout his life in the Boitokhana of the Thakurbai. Along with that, we also see how in the dark night there is still the Union Jack which is flying. So these multiple levels of narrative, location, memory all come together in how he interprets the Arabian Nights. For example, this is the story of Sindbad. And we all know Sindbad as the great sailor who had gone round the world to many great lands and brought in many treasures. But interestingly here, Abanindranath is possibly Sindbad himself, seated in the middle of the frame, picture frame. We see a very paper cut like boat which has motifs from Egypt. We see Abanindranath seated with a load of books. And possibly this is the metaphor of the great wealth that Sindbad has collected. And what is Sindbad doing here? He's sharing the knowledge of what he has gathered throughout his travels. Metaphorically, for what Abanindranath, as he said, has gathered throughout his life, and you would find all of it in these works. We see how he brings in people from different locations, from Persia to China, to even Europe and the Middle East, to his storytelling session. So how Sindbad, the sailor here, becomes the old wise man who is sharing his narrative of life with the rest of the world, just as Abanindranath was doing through these paintings. And coming to the last frame of Arabian Nights, it is interesting to note that we see in this painting how the Wazir is listening to Shehrazade's stories, and Shehrazade has completed 1,000 nights without either getting unflowered or getting killed. And Abanindranath uses this, the whole telling of the Arabian Nights, as a sort of a ploy or a parallel which he creates and wants to talk about through Shehrazade. Because what is Shehrazade doing? What does she represent here? She represents, on the one hand, there is the king's desire, which possibly Abanindranath is referring to the colonizer, and the powers of narration which Shehrazade has, because what does this power of narration do? It makes you imagine. And what is imagination? For one who does not have freedom, like the Indian people, to tell stories is to imagine. And imagine what? Imagine freedom. Because to imagine freedom is actually what is creating freedom. So possibly this is what Abanindranath wanted to do through the Arabian Nights, was to create engagement through stories, through imagination, and bringing imagination of freedom into the people Because once we imagined freedom, you could realize freedom. So with that, I come to the end of the session. I think I'm nearly out of time, so I will stop sharing. And
Thank you, sir. We have some few minutes to take few questions.
yes,
If there are any
am I
questions,
still
please
sharing
come up.
or?
No, sir. You're not sharing anymore.
Okay, then why am I not being able to see the screen?
No, I think if he wants to share something more